Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Learning and Labor Podcast. Today's one is a fun and special episode. I hope you all think so, at least. I'm going to be interviewing Trip, who is most known for running the Nomadic Warriors for Pritzker social media account. Many of you have probably already heard of this account, but don't worry if you don't know what the hell I'm talking about. We will explain the gist of it in the episode. I've gotten to know Trip a little bit, of course, also from following the social media account and just occasional conversations. And I thought it would be interesting to have him on the podcast to talk about the current situation of politics in the Midwest. We're going to, of course, talk about J.B. Pritzker, the current governor of the state of Illinois, who is the focus of the social media account, but also the current generation of Midwestern Democrats and Republicans as a whole, and how we can kind of think of these politicians and also think about the general state of politics and how we can improve it across the country. So that's the general goal of what we're talking about today. I don't have too much else to add here in the beginning, but I hope you all enjoy this, and I'm going to go ahead and roll the intro.
It therefore seems to me most important that you, the people of the state of Illinois, should know your university. Is it doing what you want it to do as the people's university? You are the owners, and your decision is final. Learning and labor. For the people and by the people. The people's university.
I guess to start off with, I just kind of wanted to give you a chance to introduce yourself and then maybe just talk a little bit about what Nomadic Warriors for Pritzker is as well. If you want to get us started with that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first, thank you for having me on. I appreciate it. My name is Trip. For the last 2 years, I have run the Twitter account and additional accounts, Nomadic Warriors for Pritzker. It's mostly a Twitter account, though I will say I think of it as an ongoing online comedy project, mostly focusing on Midwest politics, dabbling in national politics as well. Generally approaching it from a point that is to the left, the Democratic Party, all the way into social democratic ideas. And it's been a ride. It's been a lot of fun. And I'm excited to talk to you about it and about the greater Midwestern political situation as well.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I know it's something I've definitely followed the account. I don't know exactly how long, but for a while. Yeah. And I feel like it's, at least in like when I was going to the University of Illinois, people who follow politics, I feel like it was kind of like a common thing we all like thought was cool.
Oh no.
And and I feel like I guess I was just kind of curious, like what inspired the original idea behind Nomadic Warriors, and where did you kind of like get this whole thing started?
Yeah, well, it's a funny story because I was actually not only was I not in Illinois, I was not in the United States when I started the account. Back in the summer of 2022, as you probably remember, there was a lot of discussion that Biden, a very prescient discussion, that Biden wouldn't run, that someone else was going to step up and step in. And so there was a number of accounts that were created that were sort of celebrating J.B. Pritzker as the great hope, the great Midwestern hope, the big Midwestern hope that would step in and replace Biden at the top of the ticket. Mostly it was led by an account called Socialist for Pritzker, who has since become a real life friend of mine and is a wonderful person. And that was a sort of catalyzing moment that created this number of accounts. I mean, there was Maoists for Pritzker and Swiss Farmers for Pritzker and all of these goofy, fun, sort of joking, but sort of not Twitter accounts created. The journalist David Weigel saw that. He is extremely online. He's always finding things, finding new, it's almost like searching for new fungi. And so he had found the latest fungi that had sort of grown up, in that corner of Twitter. He wrote an article about it that was sort of, he named them the Pritzker Pals. And I saw that and I'm like, oh, that's hilarious. I've done this sort of anonymous tweeting on Twitter before, sort of creating joke accounts and stuff like that. And so I created Nomadic Warriors for Pritzker. Now, why nomadic warriors, right? Why not something like Maoist for Pritzker, Leninist for Pritzker, anarchist for Pritzker? Well, all of those ideas, all of those ideologies had been taken already. And so I was like, gosh, what can I do that doesn't have somebody squatting on it? I've always been really enthusiastic about Central Asian history. I majored in religious studies in college with a big focus on Tibetan Buddhism. And so I sort of had a familiarity with that world. So that was part of the reason why I created Nomadic Warriors for Pritzker. The other reason, and this is something that I haven't talked about before with anybody, is if you remember in 2020, that was the beginning of the war in Ukraine. And I was in Europe, so I was extremely aware of this. I was in Oslo at the time, but I had just been in Berlin for a couple months, so it was extremely present. I mean, you would see refugees everywhere from this war. And one of the initial justifications of the war from Putin and his cohort was that Ukraine was not a real political entity. It was this sort of historical aberration that eventually had to be reabsorbed into Russia. And I thought that was so absurd. I thought that was so funny. I mean, I thought it was so absurd to be laughable, I guess. And so I created Nomadic Warriors for Pritzker with this idea of saying, okay, what if it was a nomadic warrior that was tweeting in favor of Pritzker? And what if he sort of made fun of this irredentist ideology of saying, oh, Wisconsin, Indiana, Missouri, all of these other states, they're historical aberrations. They don't exist. They shouldn't exist. And they should all be part of the greater Illinois sphere. And so I created the account with those, I guess, two parts of history in mind. And it popped off for whatever reason. I don't know why. I still do not, to this day, understand why people like, retweet, etc. But it's really, really been a ride. And that was, I would say, the inspiration or inspirations maybe for creating that account.
Yeah, that makes sense. I never totally connected the dots about the kind of irredentist language, although obviously with that being a major theme of the account, I realized that, but I didn't connect the dots too much to Russia, which Russia's rhetoric, which it does make sense. Like, it is I think a very amusing idea to apply that concept, which is seriously being, offered in this instance to a completely kind of more ludicrous seeming situation of Illinois invading all the neighboring states.
Thank you. Yeah.
Especially, I feel like it's kind of funny for Illinois because you can kind of point to you can kind of tie it into the political thing of Pritzker and the idea of him being a very the perception of him as a out of the ordinary governor or more, especially for Illinois, and also the neighboring politics being in need of a savior of some kind, whether it's, Wisconsin's crazy situation with the Republican gerrymandering and control of statewide, or Indiana or other more conservative states nearby that are dealing with various reactionary policies. I feel like it's very interesting. It works. It synergizes surprisingly well, despite coming from a very goofy kind of place. But that makes a lot of sense, honestly, as a background.
Yeah, and the other thing that I found sort of amusing about it is that Illinois, as if it were left to its own, if the ecology of Illinois were left to its own devices, it would be a steppe. It would be a large grassland. And so that's maybe the third element that kind of fed into this idea, is that Illinois is a grassland. It is a steppe when you're not filling it with soybeans and corn. And so the idea of this great Khan expanding outwards from the steppe to conquer every other state surrounding him really synergized very well, like you said, with all of these ideas. And I think that people do, especially people on the center left and far left in some of the neighboring states, really do look at Illinois as with a sense of jealousy and a sense of envy, because he is an effective governor, and many of the other states, for whatever reason, just aren't quite as effective at solving their problems and passing legislation that would actually help people, at least in my humble opinion.
Yeah, I definitely resonate with that a little bit. I mean, I live in Ohio now,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
so not right there
Mhm.
in the early steps of the invasion would not be subsuming Illinois. Theoretically, could be. So I definitely can see where that's coming from in that part of the vision. And I guess
Mhm.
like that kind of I feel like segues nicely into like talking a little bit about what exactly is appealing about Illinois and
Yeah.
what is unique about it. I mean, obviously, we talked about the geography a little bit or the
Yes.
ecological element, like the
Yeah.
Midwest as a whole and like the Great Plains kind of region as well has a profile that you could compare to Central Asia. I mean, I'm sure there's
Sure.
many differences, which I am very ill-equipped to explain.
Uh-huh. Yeah,
But
me too, if I'm being honest. Like
yeah.
I know the vaguest. I've been to Kashmir and northern India, but I've never been to Kazakhstan and the large steppe of Central Asia.
Mhm.
So I want to go.
But I guess like politically, what do you? I mean, there's many different ways to describe politicians, right? You can
Uh-huh.
evaluate whether you agree with their policies. You can evaluate some things about them, but I think just like effectiveness at implementing policies that the
Yes.
party nominally supports is, I think, an interesting metric to look at. And I think that is definitely the area in which Pritzker is perceived, favorably, and I think accurately
Mhm.
so. So what would like be some of the examples of like why you think that he became so beloved by this kind of segment of the online political community.
Mhm.
Even if this was, obviously containing some irony or humor as well, it was based on some real feelings that people have.
Yeah, I think the part of it is a genuine surprise at Pritzker's governance. I remember in 2022, at least, there were lots of articles being written of him as Mr. Perfect. He's this excellent and exceptional figure who's doing all these great things. But 4 years before that, he was viewed with real suspicion by especially segments of the left because he's at the end of the day a fucking billionaire. He's coming out with spending billions and millions of dollars of his own money in order to win the election, at least against Rauner. And so people thought, great, here comes this neolib who's going to be like every other neoliberal governor. He's going to be a repeat of Pat Quinn and going to implement austerity policies and try to ensure that that the unions are quote unquote kept in check. People were extremely suspicious of him. And I think that over the years of his governorship, he's proven, I would say, a segment at least of the doubters wrong because he's been such an effective governor. Obviously, implementing things like an assault weapons ban, legalizing marijuana. Right now, he has a huge push in childcare. So these things are all things that the Democratic Party, like you said, nominally supports, but rarely accomplishes. And the
Hmm.
reason I think why he's been so effective at accomplishing these, and this is something that has kind of gone under the radar, is that he's been very strong on anti-corruption. And Illinois is a state that has historically had pretty severe corruption problems, not only with the governor. I mean, look at both Ryan and Blagojevich ended up in jail, right? Um, but within the lower levels, I mean, Madigan and the entire, Illinois Senate, Illinois House of Reps has always had some pretty severe corruption problems. So Pritzker has bulldozed that part of the party and rebuilt it in his image, which has allowed this flourishing of very effective governance and very effective legislation. I think another piece that bought off a lot of the skeptics, though saying bought off a lot of the skeptics is sort of ironic in this case, is that Illinois has a flat income tax. And one of his initial pushes was raising the income tax on high earners, which is really, really important. I mean, Illinois has had budget problems as long as I have been alive and as long as my parents and my grandparents have been alive virtually. And so his governance, his push to raise the income tax is something that has been very important. And unfortunately, it did not pass, but it's something that if that had not been the case, he would have been looked at with a lot more suspicion. His governance during COVID, I think, was also quite effective. though I was not in the state. I was not living in the state during the COVID lockdowns. I was actually in Kansas, which we can talk about, maybe not necessarily relevant to what we're discussing. But I think that he, in his effectiveness, has won over a lot of doubters. I think that there's some polarization against Pritzker, especially on the right. And I sometimes wonder if that polarization is due to this national political environment becoming more polarized. I don't know. I can't say. I don't really have the background of it. But I mean, I think that his work as a governor has been exceptional. Certainly the best governor of Illinois in my lifetime, in my 30-ish years. And so I cannot speak to before then, but I will say that it is somewhat a project. It's a project that's unserious until it is serious. At least I'm talking about my Twitter account right now. And generally, I've been very happy with him as a governor and his work.
Yeah, I think a lot of what you said definitely makes a lot of sense to me in terms of why he's been able to build this reputation. And I think a few other things that come to mind are the $15 minimum wage.
Yes, of course.
And the Workers' Rights Amendment, which was able to actually pass, unlike the progressive income tax push, which did fail to amend the state constitution. Because for some reason Illinois has it in the state constitution that
it's the fucking dumbest thing in the world. It's so stupid.
Which is I was like not paying as much attention politically at that point. I mean, I remember going to check what was happening and whether it passed and being like, oh, that sucks. But it's definitely kind of silly. I think that's interesting to bring up the corruption angle, because that is also kind of what I was curious to ask you about, or was interested to hear you say. Basically, I mean, you basically laid it out just like how I've been thinking about it a little bit is that Illinois is notorious for having corrupt governors and in particular, but also this kind of political machine that is kind of just known for looking out for its own interests, I guess. And, while, there are other states, especially, the news right now, obviously like Eric Adams or something like that, you can point to examples of kind of this, silly corruption. It is a little bit, it's also has a sense of irony that a billionaire who has had some weird scandals about the toilet thing or whatever, that he is seemingly, getting rid of this old corrupt political machine and rebuilding a more progressive one that seems to be more based in the actual center-left positions of the Democratic Party in a more serious way. On the historical point, I definitely would say he's the best governor of my lifetime. I having done research about specifically a few Altgeld, who was governor in the 1890s, and it's going back a long time. I would say that he probably hasn't reached that point yet, but he also was able to maintain power and get reelected, which is something that Altgeld was not able to do. And the reason I'm even really making the comparison is just part of the reason I got interested in history of Illinois and of that, Governor Altgeld himself, was because I think Carlos Ramirez Rosa, of city councilor in Chicago, compared the two and said Pritzker is, is potentially the most progressive governor since Altgeld. I think he was actually critiquing Pritzker in that statement because he was saying, and he should also do this other thing that he's not doing yet. But the point stands, I think, that this council member, who is a member of, DSA, definitely of the left, is among the group of people in political power who also view Pritzker this way, in terms of positioning him relatively quite progressively with Illinois' history, which I think is definitely really an interesting development.
Yes. No, it is certainly interesting. I do not know enough about Altgeld and his work. Obviously, of course, there's Altgeld Hall here on the University of Illinois campus, which is a beautiful building, but I really I don't know enough about him to make a cogent historical comparison between the two of them. I mean, it's something that I know you might be interested in talking about, is that Illinois and a lot of the Midwest has a history of progressive policy and progressive politics. obviously with the populists were somewhat progressive in some ways. In some ways, they were kind of reactionary. It's an interesting movement, one that I've always been fascinated by. But certainly the sewer socialists of the upper Midwest were exceptionally, an exceptional moment in American politics, and they were exceptional in their responsiveness to the needs of their constituents. And I think that one of the things that I am very pleased with Pritzker, as well as with some of these other Midwestern Democratic governors, is their responsiveness. And I think that you bringing up Eric Adams is a very interesting comparison, because many of the coastal Democratic parties in the coastal states that have large Democratic majorities don't necessarily act as responsibly to the needs of the people who've elected them into place. And so I think that's another point of people's interest when they look into the Midwest, is that they see parties rapidly passing legislation and rapidly changing their states for the better. And they go, well, why can't Gavin Newsom be as responsive? Why can't Kathy Hochul be as Hochul or Hochul? I don't know.
Not sure either, honestly.
Yeah, who cares? Why can't she be as responsive, or
Right.
for that matter? I think that it's a legitimate question. Why is it that these Midwestern parties have been so effective and so successful? And I think that part of it is that the recent history, people, I think, forget, because Illinois traditionally votes so blue. Bruce Rauner was a Republican.
Yeah.
He won with, so not a huge mandate, but Illinois is not as blue as people think it is. There are more Republicans in Illinois than in a state like, for instance, South Carolina. It's quite, especially downstate, it can be quite conservative. Real rock-ribbed red Trumpist conservative. And so I think that the Democratic parties of some of these Midwestern states are aware that their hold on power is tenuous. And so when they get power, they go, okay, we are not going to waste this. We are going to pass legislation. We are going to make a difference, because making a difference in people's lives can be a better, at least in my humble opinion, it's a better way to sell yourself than mere rhetoric. At least that's what I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a case that people on the left like to make a lot, that, Democrats would be more popular if they passed more progressive legislation, or actually,
pass
try
legislation
to
at all.
pass more things that make a meaningful change in people's lives. And I think California and New York are examples of, in many cases, how that doesn't always happen, and people, struggling with living, cost of living, and various other economic issues in these states that are not being, addressed very sufficiently by Democrats. Not to say that, Midwestern Democratic governments are, perfect on these things. Of course not. But there is definitely a sense that that's happening, and, that's being addressed more, in the policy.
And we made sure that every kid in our state gets breakfast and lunch every day. So while other states were banning books from their schools, we were banishing hunger from ours.
Honestly, that analysis has kind of been vindicated, even if it, of course, the mainstream of the Democratic Party hasn't adopted all of the policies of the left or anything. But that understanding, which I think is, a pretty normal way to look at politics, you should benefit people for them to vote for you, is kind of something that I feel like is sometimes rejected, because there's this idea that, Democrats are deserving of your vote just inherently, regardless of what they do. And I think if you look at the selection of someone like Tim Walz as the vice presidential candidate, that to some extent reflects a idea that people like this kind of politics, because I think there's many similarities you could draw between him, his government, and Pritzker. in terms of passing progressive policy. That doesn't mean that that's going to be exactly how things play out if Harrison and him do win, but it is a reflection of an acknowledgement of this political strategy as something that is legitimate, which I think is definitely interesting. And I think when comparing to history, I feel it still feels very different to me than like historical progressive movements. I'm not super familiar with, I would say the populists are probably where I'm currently the most familiar, because when I researched Altgeld historically, he was kind of elected as part of the populist movement to some extent in the Democratic Party. And I would say the more progressive portion of the populist movement, like he was an immigrant from Germany himself. So he didn't really, as far as I can tell, feed into the like worst nativist elements of the populist movement that I think were part of what made it reactionary. And also he was like very like rooted in the like labor movement and women's rights movement and other like more progressive elements at the time. And I feel like the Stewart Socialists are in like that whole, socialist party of the early 20th century, and it is something that I think I'm also very interested in learning more on, and I hope to do an episode on in the future, because it's definitely a Midwest-wide political, I mean, nationwide, but also like very, the Midwest is very important in that story. But I feel like the current moment feels very different. I mean, obviously, it's hard to evaluate it while you're living in it accurately because you don't know where things are going to end up. But it does feel like there are changing developments within the Democratic Party that acknowledge certain, progressive policies and things like that. And the question is kind of, for people on the left who want to see these changes, is how far can those go, and where, what strategies are going to be effective to pushing that even further.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that the part of the reason why the moment is different is that many of these sewer socialists and populists drew their political base from agriculturalists and the working class. Whereas right now, many of the Democratic parties, I mean, the most powerful Pritzker core, is the suburbs of Chicago, really, which is the opposite of how things have traditionally been, at least as I remember them, in that his, inner ring and to a lesser extent outer rings, the inner ring and outer ring suburbs of Chicago are very blue. And of course, inner Chicago is quite blue, as in Cook County itself is quite blue as well. So that's the opposite of how things have been traditionally. And it means that the constituencies that are voting for what passes as the left party in the United States is very different from what it was 100 years ago.
Yeah, I think that is a very interesting part, because I feel like that's part of why it feels hard to like totally accept like progressive legislation passed by Democratic governors as some sort of like inherent victory for the left. Because I mean, there are certain situations where there are like left-wing or even socialist legislators involved in passing this legislation. I know that's the case in Minnesota. And in Illinois, it's a little different. I don't think there are any out and out socialists in the legislature right now, but there are certainly many more, fairly progressive people in it who are part of the reason why these things are ending up on Pritzker's desk in the first place. But it's hard to feel like this is like, the victory of the left. It feels more like people like Pritzker are kind of, they're playing it smart. They're doing like something that is a good strategy for them. It happens to also be good for people who live in Illinois. It happens to also be good for a lot of these people. And I think that, that's not like I think that, people like Tim Walz or Pritzker know that it's good for people and they're happy about that, I'm sure. But it's also like part of a successful political strategy to be able to stay in government and to actually like govern as Democrats and stop the far right from gaining power, rather than being kind of a natural outcome of various like social movements. Although I think it's these social movements who are pushing for things like a $15 minimum wage and like, workers' rights and, amendments in Illinois and labor unions and things like that are always, of course, like a fundamental reason why these things happen. But you have to look at that and the political decision makers at the top to kind of fully understand why these individual reforms are kind of coming through.
They're keenly aware of their left flank. And I think that part of
Right.
that is a fact of what Illinois looks like in the composition of Illinois politically. But I would rather have a politician that's keenly aware of their left flank and making concessions to them than a politician who is always making concessions to the right flank, and the right is never satisfied because of the media environment and polarization environment that we're in.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And also just it's a little bit harder, I think, for Democrats to successfully pander to the right, to put it that way,
Mhm.
because if you are really a voter who really supports a right-wing policy position, you could always just vote for the Republicans. Like no one is
Yeah.
stopping you from doing that. So if you're
Mhm.
on so issue like immigration, for example, where currently, unfortunately, the Democrats nationally are going to the right. They're proposing border policies that are they are comparing to Trump's border policies, and I think
Mhm.
are similar. Pushing things in a similar direction that Trump has wanted to.
Yeah.
Um, they're doing that to try to court voters that they believe feel this way.
Mhm.
Uh, and there are a lot of people that feel that way, but the reason that they feel that way is also because the politicians are talking about it this way.
Mhm.
And if you are a voter who feels very strongly about immigration and you're very anti-immigrant and xenophobic, then you can always just vote for Trump
Yes.
instead of Harris. That isn't necessarily. It might make it like more likely to vote for her, but it isn't going to like guaranteed win any voters over because it's not going to put you in a position that you are trusted more on that issue than Trump is for that kind of like xenophobic voter out there.
Yes, yes. I think it's a huge mistake that they're going for the mythical Haley voter, right?
Yeah.
The right wing voter who is disgusted with Trump and going, he doesn't love the Constitution enough, and I have to vote for the party that will uphold the dream of America. But that voter is just going to vote for Trump because they, I think, are more interested in tax cuts. They're afraid of having a black and Indian American female president, and they, like you said, they want the real thing. I mean, promising that they're going to implement Democrats, that is, promising that they're going to implement the toughest border policy ever, is not only, I think, a failure of political strategy. I think that it's also a failure of what is going to be good for the United States. I mean, we don't
Absolutely.
need a militarized border. We need immigration reform. You went to U of I. My partner is at U of I. I cannot tell you how many incredibly talented people go here who have every intention of staying in America, and they want to use the talents that they have developed, often truly exceptional talents that they have developed. But because our immigration system is so fucked up, they only have 6 months to find a job, which is incredibly, or not even to find a job, but to put their number in the lottery, or they're going to be forced to go back home. I mean, we need a reform that is going to be welcoming to the people who are coming to America wanting to improve this country and wanting to use their skills. And the democratic rhetoric as it stands right now, I find really quite ridiculous. And I'm saying this, my folks, when I say my folks, my family came to the Midwest from Italy just a couple generations ago, and
Mhm.
so I have a lot of appreciation for wanting for, as a person who is, the great grandchild of immigrants. I have a lot of respect for people who come to this country wanting to create a better life for themselves and create a better life for their children and grandchildren and great
Mhm.
grand. And I think that the current attitude, the current pose of the National Democratic Party to immigration is just so ridiculous
Mhm.
and short-sighted.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's disappointing from like just looking at how things have shifted in the last like few decades.
Yes.
Because I mean Democrats have in the last few decades never been like an incredibly pro-immigrant party like totally, but they have made certain shifts,
Yeah.
often contrasting themselves with the, in growing, racist rhetoric from the Republicans that I think were more positive. Like I think in 2020, Biden's platform was much more progressive than on immigration than the current 2024 Democratic platform is. And that was because there was a recognition that this is a good thing for people and that our current immigration system is already incredibly draconian and difficult. It's difficult for every person, regardless of like what status you have and like where you're coming from. It's of course most difficult from people who are being racialized as other and are being treated as viciously by the right wing right now, and for the last few decades. I mean, for the whole of American history, really. But in this current moment, are especially like that's like the main rhetorical talking point Trump goes to is deporting illegal or undocumented immigrants, right? So I think it's disappointing to see that shift. And I think it's definitely a failure of political strategy. I think it's definitely a failure in just like doing what is best for people. And I think that in a better world, there wouldn't be so many barriers to just traveling from one place to another. People could even be nomadic if they wanted to, for example. And like I think that would be better for everyone. I mean, I feel like most people who have like, and this is often, unfortunately a privilege, but who have the privilege to travel other places in the world are, at least for me, that has only increased by feeling that should be even easier than it is. I mean, if you want to actually stay anywhere for a particular length of time, it is complicated. It is messy. I remember I was a child living in Berlin myself, and I was like worried that I was going to be like dealing with, I wasn't really under any risk of like dealing with any serious issues, but there was like so much, so many like boxes you have to check and things you have to fill out that like, the next appointment they could schedule to renew your visa was after your current visa expired. So you're kind of out of, in a situation where you're kind of just like relying on the goodwill of everyone involved to get through that. And, that's very easy that's like a very, like I was on like the very, the easiest possible end of the spectrum in terms of all that. And knowing that this is so incredibly difficult for, millions of people in countries, everywhere across the world is just ridiculous. And economically, culturally, it makes places worse off because there's a benefit to having more people living where you are to contribute. Yes. And there's many different ways people do that. And forcing people to not do that is just really going to make the world a worse place, and has made the world a worse place for as long as those policies have been in place. Because the truth is it wasn't always that way. And there was something similar to open borders essentially existed for the vast majority of human history.
Well, I think that there's also and to contextualize this in terms of the Midwest, there's a huge need for people in many of these states, certainly in Ohio, certainly in Illinois. And I think that one of the things that makes it so difficult for people coming here is that there's not a way for them to easily work. And so you end up in a situation where you have people working in a sort of gray economy, and they don't know when their appointment is, just like you were talking about in your experience in Berlin. They don't know when their immigration court appointment is, so they can't do things long term. I mean, it's such a mess and so badly in need of reform. And many of the states in the Midwest are badly in need of people to work and to live and to make their communities. I mean, it's one of the things that I find so disgusting about the rhetoric of some of these Midwestern Republicans, J.D. Vance, I think most prominently among them, is that their solution is to take legal immigrants and feed them into a wood chipper. I mean, it's just the most disgusting rhetorical pose I've seen in my lifetime. And I don't know what they are on. I don't know why it's so successful. I mean, it's so absurd to me. And to go back to a historical comparison, this is the type of rhetoric that they were saying about immigrants, 100, 150 years ago. I mean, there's not a sliver of light between what J.D. Vance was saying and what politicians were saying back in the late 19th century. There's a current of American politics that is aggressively anti-immigrant and aggressively nativist, which is, of course, the most absurd thing in the world, because we're a country that settled on land that didn't belong to us, And so, yeah, I think that the context of the Midwest is important, and it's important to consider the ways that our current immigration policies hurt specifically the Midwestern states. And I think that reform is incredibly important, and I think that the Democratic Party would do well to consider the way that the Upper Midwest would benefit from a more, I would say, liberal in the sense of loose and open immigration system, like you were talking about.
Yeah, definitely. And that's something I wanted to get into too, is kind of comparing the right-wing Midwestern politicians. I mean, JD Vance, definitely best example right now, as the other, vice presidential candidate. Kind of both sides are picking a Midwestern, statewide figure to even out their ticket, or maybe not so effectively, maybe not so effectively in every case, because I don't think that JD Vance is a very successful or talented politician. I think that
I agree.
He was actually, strategically a very poor choice for Trump. And I think that, he does Trump's, racist rhetoric worse than Trump does. And in a way that it comes off as kind of gross and less genuine, if that is even really possible. I don't know.
Right. Yeah. No, he comes off as ashamed, because Trump is a man with no shame. He doesn't, it is not part of his psychology. Everything he says, he believes 100%, and he doesn't give a shit about it. And that's, I think, my personal theory is that there's something broken inside of him that has absolved him of any type of shame at what he says. I think that Vance also has something broken inside of him. I think that he has a howling void that makes him endlessly seek power. But I think that he does have a sense of shame. And I think that, like you said, when he uses the Trumpist anti-immigrant rhetoric, I think he sort of knows that what he's saying is shameful. But he is saying it because this is how he can maintain his good graces within the Trumpist movement.
Just to clarify for our viewers, Springfield, Ohio does have a large number of Haitian migrants who have legal status, temporary protected status.
Well, Margaret, but
thank you, Senator. We have so much to get to.
Margaret, I think it's important because
we're going to turn out of the economy.
Thank Margaret, you. The rules were that you guys weren't going to fact check, and since you're fact checking me, I think it's important to say what's actually going on.
I think that Vance is a really interesting stand-in for the Midwestern Republican Party, because he has this sort of rags to riches background, right? And the riches that he ascended to were the highest capitalist class, right? Yale Law, into a position with a hedge fund, venture capital, and then he moved to Ohio. I mean, let's be honest, explicitly to run for office. Ran for office, didn't do that well, but still made it as a Republican senator. And I think that the politics of the Midwest are unique in that there's so many different constituencies vying for power. I think that Ohio is kind of an interesting one. I actually lived in Ohio for a couple of years while I was in graduate school, in that there's the sort of Appalachian southeast Ohio, there's Cleveland, Northeast Ohio, the Firelands, Central Ohio, Western Ohio, and each of these districts has its own composition. But there are certain groups that hold a lot of power in the Midwest. I mean, farmers among them. Farmers are a very, very powerful group, as well as exurban Republicans. I mean, the exurbs, I think, are in Ohio where the real power lies, and they are incredibly Republican, as well as, of course, local, you might call them local bourgeois, or a more localized sort of business owners, people who own small insurance agencies, who own car dealerships. These are the folks who really constitute the base of power for Midwestern Republicans. And I think that they view the world as small business owners, not necessarily aligned with global capital, but certainly afraid that if they were to lose their connection to these local businesses, they're sort of quiet millionaires. They're terrified at what that might mean, and so they vote for Republicans. I think that they, as a class of people, aren't necessarily totally bought in to the quote unquote like nationalist, or rather, they're not totally bought into the chauvinistic welfarism that I think JD Vance dances around, where it's like, we will provide a generous welfare state for the nation and for white people, and no one else is going to get anything. I think that that's a big part of the ideology that Vance purports to support. But I think that they're definitely bought into the anti-immigrant rhetoric and to the low taxes rhetoric and et cetera. So I would say that the Republican Party of the Midwest is partially supported by them, and part of it, I think, are just local shit kickers. Bernie Moreno, and oh my gosh, what was the name of the guy who ran in the primary against JD Vance? What was his name? Not Moreno.
I don't remember. I can look it up though if you want. Josh Mandel. There's a few of people. I'm trying to figure out.
Yes, Josh Mandel. Okay. So local shit kickers. I mean, Bernie Moreno, Josh Mandel, Darren Bailey here in Illinois. I think that there's this strain of populist sounding, but mostly really angry guys that is maybe specific to these states that express a sort of dissatisfaction with national politics. And I think that that's kind of an outcome of alienation. And I think that somewhere like Ohio, especially, it's very difficult because people are alienated from the legislative body and from the decisions that the Ohio state government is making, because the Ohio state government is making decisions to benefit a very, very small slice of the population, the rich people, the business owners, et cetera. And as they do that, they become more and more alienated, angrier, and then vote for Republicans. So it creates this catch-22 where, maybe the only way out of it is a sort of a sweeping nomadic horde coming in and burning it all to the ground and reforming it, or maybe a little less violently, a billionaire bulldozing the ineffective parties and rebuilding it in his image.
Yeah, I think that's definitely an interesting analysis to bring kind of the different class, components of the Midwest together to kind of see why the political situation is the way it is. I mean, I haven't been in Ohio that long, but everything you said resonates with what I have learned so far. I mean, I know in Northeast Ohio, where I live, there's like so many different like small towns near the city that are like exurbs and suburbs. And I'm just like, it's confusing how many of them there are. I just didn't know. I mean, I've never lived like near a bigger city I lived in Southern Illinois. I lived in, Central Illinois, where University of Illinois is. So I don't know how true that is around like Chicago, but I've definitely been surprised to see how many places there are near Cleveland that are like that. And that definitely, and when I'm driving through those places, there are a lot of Trump signs. So that's definitely that definitely checks out. And in terms of like the local bourgeois, like small business owners, that is definitely true. I mean, there was like a huge scandal in Ohio that I recently became interested in because my power got shut down. And it turns out the power company that I had, they had a huge corruption scandal because they basically just bribed the Ohio Republicans to give them like power, like allow them to like control the energy supply. And Cleveland has a public energy supplier as well, but they aren't, able to actually like give energy to the people of Cleveland and the Northeast Ohio area because of this private corruption. And fun fact, the son of the guy who did all that bribing also owns a bunch of small businesses in Cleveland, including restaurants and stuff like that. and
Yes.
recently was indicted for a list of horrific crimes.
Yes.
Which is, I feel like it really paints a picture of what the base of support for Republicans. They're also huge Republican donors, obviously. I mean, that's kind of how the corruption started. I think I haven't read a ton about it, but I just like learning about that. I'm like, oh, okay, I understand. I'm starting to understand what's going on here a little bit, and how this all connects to the political situation in the Midwest more broadly.
Yeah, I think that it's Larry Householder, I know, was the Speaker of the House of Representatives in Ohio who ended up, I'm not sure if he has been charged, but he was certainly indicted in this scandal. And I can't remember the names of the business owners who were the conduits for these bribes, but it was millions and millions of dollars. And if you look at the records of those court cases, I mean, they're literally texting each other like, this is a bribe. I mean, it's so ridiculous.
It's like Eric Adams stuff too, like level of stuff
really
too. It's really everyone. It's all
Eric
connected,
Adams.
I guess.
Yeah, and they're it shows how impervious they feel, and part of that is because Ohio is extremely gerrymandered, and so you've had over the last decade or so decay or degrading of the political apparatus because they don't run in competitive elections. And so they figure, oh, well, I can do whatever I want. I'm not going to be defeated. I get to choose my voters. And so you have this sort of imperviousness that settles over the Ohio House. And yes, I am very familiar. Well, I'm relatively familiar with that scandal. I think it is, on one hand, I think it's hilarious, but on the other hand, I think it's completely disgusting. I mean, so unethical and ultimately harmful to people like you who live in that area. I think, a similar scandal, the quote, friends and families plan scandal that took down Madigan and his circle of cronies was a similar thing here in Illinois, where AT&T was bribing legislators to essentially to make sure that they didn't have to be the carrier of last resort to rural places. On one hand, it was just an absolute joke, an absolute clown show. But on the other hand, it meant that people who lived in rural areas were not getting or would not have gotten the communication infrastructure that we all rely on. And so even though it is an absolutely ridiculous series of absurdities, it means that people are harmed.
Yeah.
And so I think it's why anti-corruption is such an important issue. It has sort of become a theme of our conversation, hasn't it?
Yeah.
It's such an important issue in contemporary politics because people are harmed by this. And you see figures, 10 million, 20 million, $80 million. You see these figures flying around and they become abstractions. But you have to remember that to the people who are suffering under it, these aren't abstractions, and these are not. These are. It's real life.
Yeah, and this is super anecdotal, but the people who had Cleveland Public Power did get their power turned on sooner than the people who had the illuminating company and the private power company that is involved in this corruption scandal. Part of that's probably also because they cover more people, so it took them longer. But it is like, my instinct is that the quality of service is probably worse, and that's obviously that kind of is what you're trying to do when you're bribing the state government to let you cover an area, is to have the privilege of extracting more money from people and not putting as much towards services.
Right.
And to kind of summarize that, like the Larry Householder was sentenced to 20 years in prison, so he was convicted. And Bobby George, the local Cleveland restaurateur, described by at least one person when I did a Google search as Cleveland's Elon Musk. I don't know exactly if he's going to be convicted for all of the horrific things he's accused of, but I certainly hope so. And I guess I think it's also interesting. The corruption angle is interesting because that's not something I was planning to talk about a lot, but I do think it has come up a lot, and I think it's very interesting to me because I have, as I have studied political science and one thing I've like written about and like focused on in the past when I was like going to school and just like as an interest of mine is how corruption is discussed in like Latin America and like other parts of the world and how that impacts things politically. And I think that a lot of times people don't think of it as like a particularly American problem. People think of it as, in the third world or in like, Eastern Europe or like in like these other areas, there's these super corrupt governments that are, whereas we are like just like a normal country that doesn't do all that. And,
Yeah.
part of that might be that I think corruption manifests in ways that are more publicly visible in other parts of the world, but there is still a lot of corruption happening in the United States, and there is still an appeal of a anti-corruption candidate, which can be a very dangerous thing because the appeal of someone who appears to be anti-corruption and someone who actually is anti-corruption can be very different. If you look at just like J.B. Pritzker versus Donald Trump, for example, like Trump definitely painted himself as a very anti-corruption, drain the swamp candidate. The reality of that is, of course, very different. Whereas for JB, it seems to be a little bit more sticking to what he actually said in terms of his like kind of appeal. And it's interesting that specifically billionaires have this appeal because you'd think that someone who's so wealthy would be associated more so with corruption. But I think that because of how so many people in the United States view the wealthy, they're able to kind of say, well, I don't need to take bribes because I'm already so wealthy.
Right.
And that is a very silly concept, but there is, to some extent, some truth to it at the end of the day. Maybe even less so with Trump because he isn't actually that wealthy anymore or he has like various financial problems. But someone like, Bloomberg or Pritzker or someone can legitimately just throw millions into whatever they want to. And we kind of just have to hope that whatever they want is a good thing. But it does give them some sort of like vulnerability against like the same kind of like corruption and bribery that exists in some legal and some illegal ways in the US politically.
Yeah, I think it is kind of interesting how corruption is a low salience issue in the United States, even though it is an enormous problem as we have seen in the last 5 years or so. I would say that part of that is because there are lots of prosecutions of corrupt people. I mean, everything we talked about, Madigan, Householder, Eric Adams. I mean, we know that they were corrupt because they are being and have been successfully prosecuted. But I do think that there's an issue within the United States political system of one, that it's low salience, and two, that things that would otherwise and in other political systems be considered corruption are not considered corruption in the United States.
Yeah, absolutely.
For example, I mean, the Citizens United ruling, and gosh, I remember when I was in Kansas, Missouri area, I remember reading about this battle that they were having over people who could give unlimited gifts to Missouri representatives. And it was just this awful mess because the representatives are like, why can't someone give me a car? And they're just our friends. And so you have this absurd, or Clarence Thomas, I think, is another perfect example.
Yeah, that's one I was going to point out too.
Yeah, like this is an incredibly corrupt system, but it's not called corruption. It's not considered corruption. The media isn't labeling it corruption. But by any standards in the rest of the world, it is a sickening example of corrupt practices. I think that, yeah, I just want to do a shout out to DJ Burns, who publishes his work as the Rooster in Ohio. I don't know if you have read him, but so much of my information of the Householder trial and the Georgias comes from him and comes from his work. He's just a excellent muckraker, and when it comes to learning about Ohio politics, at least he's the man to go to.
Yeah, well, I'll definitely check that out as I'm easing into my my knowledge on Ohio politics. Yeah. I've tried not to learn to dive in too deep at once. But
of course,
since I'm kind of keeping my one foot in each state a little bit in terms of like what I'm paying attention to. But
Yeah.
I feel like it is definitely an issue that is very present on every level of politics in the United States. Like if you go to the local level, a lot of times people who are in city council are going to be people who like directly financially benefit from certain policies, whether they're landlords or business owners or whatever. And that's
Yes.
kind of like the norm because who else has time to serve on city council and get paid, nothing
Hmm.
significant for your time. It's
Yeah.
people who already have a source of income. And then
Mm.
as you move up and up into the world, you get, kind of a more regulated form of corruption and just the way that
Mhm.
elections are run by whoever has the most money. And that's easier to get from rich people than who are going to want you to do certain things than from,
Mhm.
everyday working people who are going to want you to do other things that might help them. So
Yes.
I think it's definitely a underrated idea. I think it's something that's very present in most people's minds, but it's not as explicitly talked about as corruption in the way it might be if we were thinking about a different country. It's
Hmm.
not viewed
Yeah.
as like the same way. And
Mhm.
I think a lot of people do think that we have a corrupt political system in one way or the other, but they also simultaneously view it as a democratic political system. So it's like there's a lot of contradictions within a lot of people's worldviews and within the worldviews of various different segments of people in the United
Mhm.
States, which are hard to kind of fit all together, super in a super neat idea.
There's a sort of cognitive dissonance that
Hmm.
happens when people look at the United States and when they look at other countries, because they look at other countries and say, wow, thank God that's not happening here. But of course, it is happening here. We just refuse
Exactly.
to
Yeah.
acknowledge it.
Yeah. It's like it's also something that I feel like unfortunately is more and more in my mind about like any like foreign policy of the United States is the kind of like a
Yes.
disregard for people dying. When people point to that, in the US, obviously there's plenty of examples of that to point to. Right now we have even in if you're looking at a very narrow view of like the United States caring about like Americans, right?
Hmm.
There's Americans who have been killed in Palestine and recently that the U.S. doesn't really seem to care much about. Now, obviously, you would hope your country cares about people regardless of their nationality as well, and is not, arming and having people be killed for any reason, But it is interesting to look at that and then reflect upon how inside of the United States, we have issues like school shootings, where kind of the value of life is also seen as not really, or like our healthcare system, where like there's plenty of ways internally to our country that people's lives are kind of not really treated with the respect and dignity they reserve. And unfortunately, I think people don't always, connect those dots because it seems like, oh, this is something going on in a faraway place
Hmm.
where maybe people think our government's doing something wrong. Maybe they don't think that, but they kind of see this kind of like senseless loss of life, and they don't always connect that to the same kind of problems in the United States.
The violence of empire always comes home, right? I mean,
Hmm.
that's a sort of principle that I think has been overlooked, and I think it's also been proven to be true in the last 20 years as I've seen
Hmm.
increasing militarism and increasing power of the security state. And it's concerning to me, right? And I think that I'm, I don't want to get too deep into this because we're focusing on the Midwest here, but it's very concerning, and I hope that we're able to, as we continue to sort of propagate a more just and more forward-looking way of politics in the Midwest, I hope that we're able to successfully get ourselves away from such violence and such terror.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think like the good example of that is what we talked about earlier with the border policy.
Mhm.
That
It's
obviously is still seen as like affecting some other people, other places, but in reality, that enforcement is occurring throughout the United States. It's not like something that we can kind of like just like look the other way and pretend it's happening somewhere else because it is happening, everywhere across the country, including in the Midwest. And the same thing with like the militarization of police, which is very much an issue. I mean, some of the worst instances of police brutality have happened in Illinois very recently,
yes.
in Missouri, in I don't know. I don't know where all of them. I can't start. I probably could list every state, and there would be an example that I could think of. But because there's so many, it's hard to keep track.
Right.
So I think like all of that is very interconnected, and I think that's the unfortunate reality we find ourselves in the Midwest. And I think that the progressive policies that we've seen passed, some of which have tackled criminal justice in Illinois, there has been some things like bail reform. There has been certain measures that are give me at least a little bit of hope, even if I still see so much wrong. I hope that the current, like, to kind of take it back to where we started with Pritzker and with all the other center left Democratic governors in the Midwest, Gretchen Whitmer probably is another good example. I hope that these kind of policies, whether it be, I think also legalization of cannabis is a criminal justice policy, very much so as well. That's a good one to point to that has happened in Minnesota, Michigan, Illinois, also Ohio recently. And I think like those kind of things are good. And the question is just kind of like how in the future can those things connect to a actual political movement or, more serious like reorganization of society rather than just a charismatic leader who is thankfully bringing us some good policies along the way.
Yes.
Which we can be excited for in some sense, but also I hope like not lose sight of the limits of that because and see it as more of a beginning than an end, I guess. At least that's how I look at it with people like J.B. Pritzker.
And it's funny, we haven't even touched on bail reform, which is
is a pretty big one.
It's a huge one, and there are so many policies that have happened that we haven't even had the chance to touch on just because of the sheer number of them. But I think that you're making a really good point, which is that I am on the lookout for an articulation of a larger political project that encompasses all of these reforms. I mean, whether it's bail reform, cannabis reform, free school lunches like you see in Minnesota, tax reform, I mean, anti-corruption. There is a larger political project at work here, I think, but I'm waiting on the articulation of it. I don't necessarily see it being articulated by Kamala Harris at this point. I hope that it is articulated in the future. I think that Biden in some ways on a national level implemented this type of top-down legislation, but again, I don't think he was a very strong articulator of it. And so once that is articulated, I look forward to combing through it and seeing it, but I don't think that it's happened yet. I don't know if it's because it's nascent. I don't know if it's because there is a sort of bias against it within the Democratic Party where they have to say, all right, we have to let the people at the top speak to what they need to speak to win this election. But I think that there is something that is afoot in the Midwest. And I hope in the next few years we can see this good governance liberalism, let's call it for now, articulated more forcefully. I think that Pritzker is a strong articulator of it, but I look forward to the day when it can be maybe historicized or maybe written down in a big book or something like that, so that we can really understand the moment that we're in.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to maybe wrap up that part of our discussion. Before we go, I did just want to ask one last question to kind of maybe end on a lighter note, perhaps, since we've talked about a lot of
talked about some serious
difficult stuff here, definitely. So I guess like my last question is, what contact have you had, if any, with J.B. Pritzker, and what references has he made to nomadic warriors?
Sure. Well, on the night of his reelection, he shocked me when he said in his acceptance speech, every happy warrior must have a little bit of a nomadic warrior in them as well. I heard that and I like jumped off the couch and was like, my God,
Facing this moment requires that every happy warrior find a little bit of a nomadic warrior in them as well.
I was like, all right, that's it. Can't get any better. But it turns out I get a call a couple days later I'm just hanging out. Me and my partner, we're on a Saturday morning, relaxing, and I get a call on my cell phone, and I see unlisted number, and I'm like, "Uh-oh, this is gonna
Right.
mess up." And so I open up my phone, and I hear Trip, and I'm like, "Yes." It's like, "This is Governor J.B. Pritzker. How
Oh
are
my
you?"
gosh.
And my God, he called me on I guess it was a Sunday morning. And we had a little discussion. He made some jokes. He was very kind. He was very gracious, talking about my Twitter account. He also proposed that Illinois does have the highest number of National Guard troops, so just keep that in your back pocket for the future. Maybe we get them on horses and get them some composite bows. Um, so that is probably the most meaningful contact I've had with him. I've had some contact with his staff. They've always been very nice to me. He did post a picture a couple months ago of him with a falcon, which I thought was very
Oh
great
yeah.
of him because a falcon and he looked very noble in front of a castle with that. And I did go to the DNC and I passed out a couple of Pritzker for Khan pins there. I did not see. Actually, I did see him. As he quickly zipped along a hallway, and I was like, "Whoa, there he is in the flesh." I have not, outside of seeing him deliver a speech. I have not actually shaken his hand and healed and pledged my fealty to the great Khan himself. So I am still waiting on that day.
Yeah, with that being said, I've never met the guy.
Yeah.
He came to U of I once. I ended up not going to the.
Oh no!
I had something. I had some conflict. I couldn't go to the work or something where I couldn't go. It was very interesting to hear all that, and I wonder if he'll make any future references to this nomadic way of life.
Yes, the nomadic movement. We are the Midwest's largest non-sedentary political advocacy organization, I like to say. So, with a membership of one, maybe now two, but
yeah,
no,
maybe a few more.
it's been it's good that he views it with the humor and skepticism necessary. There's nothing worse than when a meme is enveloped by the body that it is of a meme of. I think of like the Dark Brandon thing.
Oh yeah, that doesn't feel so good.
Yeah, when like Democrat apparatchiks started posting Dark Brandon memes, you're like, no, you're not supposed to do this. No, it's over. Oh no.
More subtle. The subtler references are in some ways more powerful than a outright embrace of a meme, especially when it's from someone who doesn't appear to really get it. The worst of that, I think, is Joe Biden drinking some Dark Brandon drink or some meme kind of drink before the debate in which he utterly failed to represent himself as a candidate, leading to his resignation from the race. But
yes, drinking the Dark Brandon juice and then just destroying his career in an hour.
Yeah.
It was like, oh man, I hope that never happens to the Nomadic Warriors for Pritzker meme.
Yeah. Well, don't let him make any Nomadic Warrior drinks that he can. Then I think you should be good.
Yes, right. Well, he did do the J beer for for the DNC, and that was I had a glass and it was pretty good. I will say it was a pretty good beer. So as long as he stays in that realm of the dad jokes, I think we're going to be okay.
That actually, I know that I said I want to wrap up, but that actually kind of reminds me of a whole thing that we didn't really touch on, which is just kind of his kind of jovial character more generally being a big part of the appeal. Drinking has been a part of that with the whole him doing shots at Pride and stuff like that I feel was definitely something people saw and was that's kind of cool.
Yeah, well, I think that he's eminently memeable. Definitely. Part of that is just he's photographable, right? He looks like a big jovial guy. I think that there's also an element of his character where he's fairly harmless and is kind of he gives off this vibe of being a fairly innocuous but very competent guy, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the contrast of that image, like his actual public image, with being like he's a bloodthirsty tyrant who will Milwaukee to dust, I think is part of what makes the Nomadic Warriors thing successful.
Definitely.
And I think that he understands that, and so he holds it at an amused arm's length. And Cap does as well. Yeah, and I don't know. I think that he's amused by it. I think that he is appreciative of it. But I also think that he knows enough to be like, we're not going to wholesale embrace this, because if we did, it would wilt the plant, as it were.
Yes. He definitely doesn't appear to have many actual similarities with Genghis Khan in terms of his leadership style, I would say. So that's a good point.
Was a very effective leader. He certainly was effective at what he did. You can say that much.
That's true. I can't deny that. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast, and it was great talking to you. And I think this is a good wide-ranging conversation on kind of the politics of the Midwest and how that connects to what you've been doing with your social media project here. And it was great. It was great to talk to you.
Well, thank you so much, Nico. I really appreciate you having me on. Anytime, I'm always happy to chat and solve the world's problems, as it were.
Absolutely. All right, well, that's all of my discussion with Trip. I hope you all enjoyed it. Make sure to check out Nomadic Warriors for Pritzker on social media. I'll leave a link to the socials and everything like that in the description of this episode. And I guess there's a few things before I finally wrap up the episode that I wanted to touch on that I've been thinking about ever since we recorded this episode, and kind of I want to present as not necessarily a complete answer to some of the questions we talked about, but at least how I'm feeling about it now with some more time to digest. It's been a little less than a week since we recorded it, and I've been busy editing this as well as just, going about my day-to-day life, and it's been something I've been thinking about. I guess first, I think that the question we kind of left off with is, what is the political project that connects all of these positive reforms that have been passed by Midwestern Democrats, for example, from childcare to ending cash bail to legalizing cannabis? And why are these not articulated in a coherent way by the mainstream of politics, by Joe Biden, by Kamala Harris, in a way that is consistent? So usually, you might find certain reforms or certain policies are passed in one state, but not another state. And they're certainly not articulated by any presidential candidate in a consistent way that doesn't falter on some issue. The answer that I kind of felt is that these are policies that in one way or the other push back a little bit on the kind of inherent natures of capitalism, whether it be, providing school lunches for people who can't afford to pay for it, or, leave for people who are working and need time off for medical issues, for family crises, that kind of thing. These are things that tip the scales a little bit further and help working people. And so inherently, the mainstream political parties that are connected to the interests of the wealthy in one way or the other are not going to want to fully embrace these policies, even if they will accept one or the other at any given moment, because it would kind of go against the interest of their main donors and the main constituencies that they ultimately represent. Which is not to say that, they won't ever advocate or even articulate rhetoric that is critical of these wealthy people, and they might mean it. But it's not going to ever completely change or be embraced, I think, unless you have a more coherent anti-capitalist, even socialist political force in the country. At least that's kind of what I think, and that's why I'm personally a member of the Democratic Socialists of America. And I think that that's something I truly believe is necessary, not just to, completely change the political system and the economic system, which I do believe in, but even to make these more piecemeal reforms in a more holistic way, and not just rely on the whims of individual politicians. Because I think that if you have a more coherent left-wing vision articulated, that is at least required to see the political change follow. You can't really have all of these policies passed without a vision that explains why they're all necessary in one way or the other. Why is our system depriving people of enough money to pay for their children to not go hungry, for example? Anyway, that's like a basic gist of what I've been thinking about recently, and that's not to defy any of the conclusions we reached about this kind of good governance liberalism that is practiced by J.B. Pritzker. I think that is definitely a better alternative than, bad governance liberalism in terms of improving the quality of lives for people. And I think it is definitely, worthy of some level of appreciation with respect to the right wing and the, in this case, Midwestern Republicans that we spoke about in this episode. But I do think that it has its limits, and I think that those limits will not be broken unless there is also some sort of explicitly left-wing political anti-capitalist socialist movement in the United States. So that's kind of, I guess, something that I felt like it is worthy articulating, since that's, how I've been thinking about it. And I wanted to add that kind of onto the end of this conversation as just my personal thoughts. I'm not speaking for Tripp or anyone else here, but something that I feel like was important for me to add on it to all of this. I think this conversation tied into many different themes of this podcast that I have talked about before, which, if you are a new listener or if you haven't listened to all of our previous episodes yet, I think would be really interesting to kind of connect to. So one of the most obvious ones is we talked about Governor Altgeld, who served in the 1890s in Illinois, and I have a whole 2-part episode dedicated to him and his life and his contributions politically, which I definitely would encourage anyone to check out if that sounded interesting. I also have a full episode touching on the University of Illinois' connection to the theft of indigenous land, which we didn't talk about super heavily in this episode, but we did mention, Tripp did mention at some point, the kind of irony of being anti-immigrant and also existing in a settler colony that is based on immigrating somewhere and stealing land from people. So I thought I would definitely shout out that first episode, which I think is still one of my best, that covers the story of how that all connects to the University of Illinois and how the University of Illinois has financially profited and was essentially founded on the basis of stolen indigenous land. And I also wanted to shout out the more recent episode that I released, which is an interview with Brady from the Illinois Legislative Staff Association, because I think that kind of provides a different angle on Illinois politics that shows a little bit of hypocrisy within, maybe some of the cracks within this good governance liberalism in terms of how the Illinois legislature is treating its own workers and preventing them from unionizing, specifically in the speaker's office. So I definitely encourage anyone who hasn't already to check out that episode as well, as I think it provides a kind of different angle on the current situation in Illinois politically, even if it's a more narrow focus than this kind of wide-ranging conversation that I just had with Tripp. So with that all in mind, I want to thank you all so much for listening to this, and especially listening to me, kind of just rambling off some random thoughts here on the end of it. I appreciate it so much, and I hope to talk to you again soon. Bye-bye.
Learning and labor. Station WILL has carried a special program this week giving information about the University of Illinois. If you have been a listener to these broadcasts, you have heard more or less about what the university does, how it does it, and what it hopes to do. Thank you, Dr. Willard.